right, Blastoff Comics. We're here at San Diego, 2012. We're here with Steve Englehart, comics writer, novelist, legend, creator of some extraordinary pieces of history for comics. Steve, thanks for joining us.
You're
really
welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jud.
Okay, so we've been doing a lot of talking with some of the mothers and fathers of the comic industry, and overriding themes have been, for artists, they talk about the Joe Kubert School.
Right.
They talk about what it was like to run around. It was talking about the transition from the school into the city, into New York. And, you know, a lot of people were talking about how New York was the place, the melting pot, but the place where all of you were kind of with each other, like a university. It was like a university city.
Yes.
So in the 70s, what was it like for you?
Well, again, in those days, in order to do comics, you had to go to New York. That was the, you know, people would say, well, how do you get into comics? And I'd say, the first thing you do is you go to New York and sleep on somebody's couch. You know, I mean, that was literally the first step. Once you got into comics, which usually didn't take, if you had some talent, didn't take that long, because you'd go around to Marvel and DC and show them your stuff, and pretty quickly somebody would miss a deadline and they'd go, well, let's try that guy. And it was a very egalitarian thing. I mean, if you were in the club, you were in the club, and nobody said, well, you're the new guy and that's Wally Wood and you can't talk. I mean, Wally Wood and I rode around the subway drunk at one point, you know? I mean, people would throw parties, anybody would show up, and it was a very, you were living in comic books. I mean, it was like all the legends, all the people who were doing it, everybody from every level was all together. And so you were not only learning, as you say, the university of how to do it and how to make it work, but also just the gestalt, you know, what it's like to be a comic book person. My story, trickier. I had wanted to be an artist. Art was the thing that really dragged me into comics, that I really wanted to do.
Did you go to school for that?
Nope. I just, you know, I was self-taught, but I had the balls to go talk to Dick Giordano at one point and say, you know, here's my art. And he said, but, you know, keep showing it to me. And what eventually happened was I went to Neil Adams and said, I'd really like to work with you sometime. And he said, okay, and sort of took me in. And Neil, you know, later had a whole studio full of people working with him, the Krusty Bunkers things, but I was kind of the first guy that he took on. And of course, Neil was like the greatest artist ever at that point, and I was down here. But he taught me a lot of stuff. He was very open, often. And so that sort of, I ended up knowing people, having some published stuff. So that's kind of how I got around. Problem was, I was still not that great an artist, but it got me into the mix. And then Gary Friedrich, used to write Sergeant Fury and so forth, was also an assistant editor at Marvel, and a stewardess was murdered in the apartment directly above his, and his wife said, why don't we go back to your home state of Missouri for a while? I don't feel comfortable living here. So he said, all right, and I got this call out of the blue. He says, I'm going to go to Missouri for 6 weeks. Would you fill in for me at Marvel? And I almost said no, because I was living 2 hours outside the city. But but all right. So I did the 2 hours in, 2 hours out commute every day on the train. And at the end of 6 weeks, he decided, screw it, I like Missouri, I don't want to come back. So then I was sort of on staff at Marvel, and they were giving me things to do, and they were kind of looking at my artwork like, and then they said, you want to write something? And I did, and I liked writing it, and they liked what I wrote, and all of a sudden I was a comic book writer. That's my story. But I will say, back when I was a fan, I went to college a couple hours outside New York City, so it was easy enough to go down. And once I went to Marvel, and they said, look, we're small, we don't have time to deal with you. But I went to DC, where they said, you're interested in this? I mean, it's, you know, DC was so corporate and still is, but they didn't know. And they finally said, yeah, you wanna talk to Julie Schwartz? And I'm like, yeah. So I went in, and Julie gave me a half hour of his time, you know, just talking. I was just a fan. I wasn't trying to get in at that point, but it was just, you know, he gave me the time. And when it was over, he said, you know, on the wall over there, I've got like original art, you know, from like the Brave and Bold Justice League and stuff like that. If you'd like any, you can take it, you know, because it didn't mean anything in those days to those guys. So I met Julie and got some art, and that was all part of my rolling in that direction,
And there was a lot of work that you did with a huge cast of characters. You would do these team books.
It's
epic, cosmic, every character's involved, as many as we can get on the page. But is that how you jumped in, or did you start off? Because I know you did Doctor Strange, you did a single character and a single button.
No, I started with the Beast. The X-Men had failed, had been canceled, and they were trying to resurrect it somehow, and they came up with this idea of doing the Beast all by himself, because they were doing Werewolf by Night and other monsters, and they thought, well, maybe the Beast will work. So Jerry Conway wrote the first issue, and then they gave it to me, the young guy that they had just recently said, you want to try something? And I couldn't sell him either, but they liked the writing. So they came and they said, you want to do Captain America and the Defenders too? It's like, sure. And that's a thing, I mean, at the time, that's just the way comics were, and it meant nothing. Nowadays, I tell this story and people go, they just gave you Captain America? But it wasn't a big movie property in those days. It was just a comic book. But so yeah, I did Captain America as the single thing, and then Defenders as a group book, and I found that I liked both. I mean, I like characters. I like getting inside the different guys, and so whether it's one guy or whether it's a bunch of guys, I like seeing the differences and playing with them. Right. And so really, I picked up a lot of books real quick in that time, but the next big thing really was the Avengers, and that's the one that clearly is where Roy, who was the editor-in-chief, said, I'm giving it to you. So he must have liked what I was doing. That's the one where I can say, I must have been doing okay, I wasn't on trial anymore. But I don't recall anybody thinking, I can't do this. I mean, we all felt like we'd grown up on it, we knew the characters, we really wanted to do it. And I mean, you want it to be good, and I know from my Avengers standpoint, I spent the first six months, year, trying to sort of do Roy stories. And it wasn't until I kind of said, let's do my stories, that I felt like I had really figured it out. Right. I mean, there was definitely a learning curve involved.
Everyone learns so much, they bring so much more to the writing.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see you doing an Avengers story.
So would I, but I
would bring to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that group, and I like, as I say, the whole thing of doing a team book. But the business is very different now. Yeah. I haven't done comics now for 5-6 years, and toward the end,
none at all. And I'm talking about even at home when you're
right.
Like, hey,
no, I write novels now. I'm writing novels now, but because of all those weird circumstances, they would say, "Here, take this book." And I mean, what Roy said to me when he gave me Captain America, I've told the story a million times, but he said, "You have to turn this book in on time, and you have to make it sell. If you can do those things, then you're done. I mean, that's all you got to do. If you can't do those things, we'll fire you and find somebody who can do those things." But that was the only editorial oversight. Toward the end of my career in comics, they would say, well, give us an outline of what it is you're going to do, and then an outline of the next 12 issues. And I wrote everything sort of in the spur of the moment. I mean, it was like...
It was organic.
I would think, sometimes I'd think, well, here's what I'm going to do next month or whatever, but only in the abstract. It was when I got to that point that I'd say, now I get to do that, and I'd be like white hot in the moment kind of thing. I think if I had to tell you what I was going to do in issue 12, and then a year later, I'm going, yeah, that's okay, that's what I have to do this time, I'd blow my brains out, or I'd leave the business, It's become much more Hollywood, and I don't begrudge really what needs to be done along those lines, but it's nothing like the business that I was in.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could say it's comics. No, that's totally different. And I'm not really interested. I mean, it wouldn't be fun for me to do that. I mean, if they came and they said, write something, and it's got to fit in, but we're not going to micromanage it.
Right.
And for a one shot or something, I mean, if I could approximate what it is that I did, then I do it. But I don't demand that they give me special treatment, and I don't think they're going to do it. So there you go.
One of the things that I've been asking everybody is,
Yeah.
okay, first comic you ever remember reading?
There's three that I don't know which was first, but probably Walt Disney's Comics and Stories.
Okay.
Barks, but also the Mickey Mouse stuff in the back, which I quite like. But I also read Dick Tracy, the reprints as comics, and I read Batman. All those three, and the thing that they have in common, not the Bark stuff so much, but the Mickey Mouse, the Dick Tracy, and the Batman, they were all dark. They all had a real darkness to them. I mean, not necessarily a scary darkness, but the look of it, again, art was what brought me into the whole thing. And that heavy ink line and all that juicy stuff, that I resonated with that. That gave me a nice feeling to live in that world, to go live in a world of dark shadows and so forth.
And where did you get them?
I'm sure at the local, drugstore. I can remember, this was later on, but I can remember every Saturday riding my bike over to where the movie theater was, where you could see
this?
Louisville. This was in Louisville, Kentucky. You could see a double feature and an hour of cartoons for a quarter, right? And on a Saturday afternoon. So I'd see two movies, but I'd also see an hour of Looney Tunes and all all that good stuff. But before that, we'd hit this drugstore where you would get the infrared hamburgers. Before there was microwave, they used to put them in like an infrared oven.
Wow.
And they tasted weird, I'm sure, but there they were. And a chocolate Coke from the fountain, from the guy made it at the fountain, and the comic books on the rack over there. That was the reality that I lived in. So every Saturday, 2 movies, an hour of cartoons, comic books, bad hamburgers, everything you need to become a comic book guy.
And did you find stories there where you would get this comic and then you would read it and go, what happens next?
Well, and I think mostly those stories were all self-contained back then, yeah. But I'd get into characters, and I would follow the characters. When I was this age, it was in the 50s, and so we were basically all you had was Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman,
right,
along those lines. So then there was Dick Tracy, and there was Ducks and other things, but wasn't a lot of superheroes other than these 3 guys, and they were, on the one hand, they were the superheroes. On the other hand, they were pretty boring, as far as, the 50s, those characters in the 50s became very stolid.
Yeah.
It was before Marvel. And in fact, I outgrew comics the way kids do, but it wasn't until I was at the end of my freshman year in high school in the 60s that a guy came up to me and shoved a Spider-Man in my face and said, "You've got to read this." It was a Ditko, Steve Ditko, Stan Lee Spider-Man in the early 60s. And I loved it. I just I said that, yeah, and became a total Marvel guy. And then because comics were so cheap, and there were a lot of them, but they were only 10 or 12 cents or something in those days. So I buying all the Marvels and all the DCs, and then the Gold Keys and the Towers and the Dells, and So it was kind of like where we started this conversation about going to New York and being involved with everybody. I was involved with the whole comic book thing. I mean, I saw these different artists, Russ Manning over here doing Magnus Robot Fighter, that kind of things that you would never see today because it would be too far off the map. So I saw different companies, I saw different approaches, different levels of artwork, and different storytelling. So, I bought into the whole thing of comics as a medium, with a history and people and stuff,
This is great talking with you. I really appreciate you taking time to spend with us and go through the history, not just your history, but the history of our industry. I hope that we can do this again and maybe go a little bit more in depth about some things that we want to talk about.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jud.
All right.